severe and charming authority. Sarn had been George Palmer Jones's home for the first 18 years of his life. As a boy, he had never mixed socially with the family at Gorse Hill, though he and Eleanor were almost contemporaries. He came from a respectable business family in the town. His father was a solicitor, and Gorse Hill, with its parties and connections with the outside world, seemed very grand and exotic. Nevertheless, he and his wife Molly had been guests at the house before it became a hotel. George had known Eleanor's husband. They were both reputable ornithologists. George was an amateur whose first commitment was to his work as a Home Office civil servant. Stuart Masefield was a professional, an academic who in later life had given up his post with the Research Council to write books on raptors. George had never liked the man and had been embarrassed by the effusive greeting he received every time they met, the pressing invitations to stay at Gorse Hill. He had never considered Stuart Masefield a friend, and all they had in common was the place of George's birth. Yet he had agreed in the end to spend a weekend with Stuart and Eleanor Masefield. It had been the spring before Stuart died. George had been editing a collection of papers and needed Masefield's expertise. It had been late April. The weekend had begun pleasantly enough. There had been, George remembered, a good dinner, followed by easy conversation about the history of that part of the Welsh marches. Even then, Eleanor had been a good hostess. But the next day, Masefield had taken George into the room he called his study. It was a square, brown room with one small window which looked onto the hillside. It had the same smell and the same jumble of exhibits as a poor provincial museum. It shocked George profoundly. 2 shotguns stood in one corner. On wooden shelves there were rows of stuffed birds of prey, with several examples of the same species, especially golden eagle, buzzard, and peregrine. On the walls were a series of photographs of birds on the nest, and, in 2 large cabinets, tray after tray of raptors' eggs, many arranged in complete clutches, all carefully labelled. It seemed to George then that the man's interest in birds was acquisitive, possessive. "Aren't these illegal?" George had asked. Masefield smiled secretively, became for George a cartoon of a miser. "Oh, no," he said smoothly. "None of them were taken illegally, you know, and they're all essential for my research." Immediately afterwards, Masefield had insisted on taking George for a walk. George had not wanted to go, but almost rudely Masefield refused to listen to his excuses. They had walked together through a blustery west wind up the hill behind the house. There was a steep rocky outcrop, a cliff face in the hillside, and halfway up the bare rock was a peregrine eyrie. Peregrines were rarer then, still suffering from the widespread use of pesticides, and on an inland English site in the south were unknown. Despite his distaste for Masefield, George was thrilled to watch the male peregrine carry a pigeon to its plucking post, then fly off again towards Wales. "They came back last year," Masefield shouted above the wind. "There was an eyrie here in Elizabethan times. I knew they would come back." His voice was altered, uncontrolled. It was as if the birds had belonged to him, as if in some way he had drawn them back to him. George felt the man was unbalanced, and felt suddenly sorry for Eleanor. He suffered the rest of the weekend with unease, and did not return to Gorse Hill until after Masefield's death. They returned quite regularly when the place was a hotel. George had an elderly aunt in a nursing home in Sarn, and they visited her for ritual conversation and afternoon tea. No other relatives were left in the town, so Gorse Hill was the natural place to stay. Besides, George thought they should support Eleanor. He admired her cool efficiency and independence. He was attracted to her elegance. He thought he had been attracted to her since their first meeting. He never discussed Eleanor with his wife, but Molly seemed to accept that he enjoyed Eleanor's company and never objected to staying at the hotel. The food was excellent, and she seemed not to mind listening to Veronica's stories. During their marriage, she had never expressed jealousy. She must have known that, in fact, there was no competition. It seemed to their acquaintances in Sarn that Eleanor was a friend of them both. Nevertheless, they were surprised when Eleanor